now, we're good?
You are.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Adam. Okay, good morning, guys. Okay, this is actually your last lecture, okay? We'll finish the course today, all right? Which means that you can get started on a final exam, get it into me. Remember, it's got to be postmarked by Tuesday the 12th of May, okay? All right? Shouldn't be a problem. Call me if you have any questions, okay? I offer that every week, and I mean that, okay? So I'm kind of your lifeline here on that. Also, so don't look for any more lectures after this. All right. I did include, when I sent out a mailing to you, you should have gotten it by now. I sent it out Wednesday. Okay, it included not only the handout packet for today, and a note sheet, but also too I included a mailing sticker which has my address on it, so you can make that easy. Just peel that off and put it on the envelope. Sorry, you're gonna spend 55 cents. Okay, but I won't even tell you how much money I've spent with mailings this semester, but it's okay. It's part of the job. All right. Really, 2/3 of you have done your project. Okay. All right. 4 people still owe a book review. 1 person still owes everything. Okay. But bottom line is that all you have to work on now is that final exam, and you're good to go. Okay. All right. If you feel you'd like some extra credit or something like that, okay, the easiest thing to do is another movie. That's all. Okay. If you send it to me, make sure that you mark it as extra credit. What else do I have here? Okay. All right. Okay, what did I write? Okay, oh yeah, I've been giving you hints for that final exam question about 20 items, okay, that enabled the Allies to win the war against the Axis powers. So I've been giving you some stuff that doesn't often crop up in the textbooks and the history books, things like that. So today's hint, this will be hint number 3 now, if you follow this, if you're paying attention, okay, all right? Any attacking force generally needs a 3-to-1 ratio over the defenders. So you estimate the number of defenders, say it's 8,000, you're going to need 24,000 guys, okay, all right? Let's consider this, the Japanese islands. If they hadn't done those suicide, I understand Japanese culture, if they hadn't done the suicide banzai charges and the harakiri, okay, on a massive scale, and instead utilize the defense in depth that they used on Biak, Peleliu, all right, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, okay, to inflict horrific casualties on the Allies, maybe things would have changed, okay, all right? So you don't see that one often. There's another one you can deal with, okay? All right, so let's get started with today. I sent you a handout that had an interesting thing. It's an ongoing project with me, all right? I wanted to come up with, I read them and I say to myself, I got to remember that, and I don't, so I need to write them down, okay? The logistics in war page, okay? I'm using that for multiple classes, okay? All right, I've got them on the Civil War, I've got them on the Modern War, Afghanistan, Iraq, things like that. And I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading it, okay? But there's a couple that jump off the page at me here, okay? 1, each Marine assaulting Iwo Jima needed 1,322 pounds of supplies. Each Marine. Logistics are incredibly important in warfare. Then it gets overlooked, okay, all right? The Red Ball Express, I gave you the numbers on that. I think we did talk about that briefly in the European theater. If I didn't, okay, we're looking here at 900 supply trucks a day, okay. I think it ran, yeah, it did run from August 1944 to November 44. And they ran 412,193 tons of supplies to the front. A lot of it was food, socks, believe it or not, to prevent frostbite. Okay, change your socks. Okay, Eisenhower issued an order on that regard. Okay, but also too, look at that next statistic. Eisenhower's U.S. Army in the European theater in Western Europe fired off 2 tons of ammunition per minute in World War II in the European theater. My God, okay, all right, you got to get the supplies of ammo to the front. A lot of those drivers were African-American drivers. Famous baseball player Leon Day was involved with the Red Ball Express. He came ashore in Utah Beach, you know, after the fighting, but he came ashore then. Army Group Center for the Germans needed 27 fuel deliveries a day, okay, and then you got some numbers on fuels here. 1 tank would use 3,000 gallons of fuel per week. That's over 1,000 gallons a day. Not exactly fuel efficient, okay, but at any rate, they needed 12,500 gallons to move 100 yards, 125,000 gallons to move 100 yards. I got to check that. That doesn't sound right. Okay, so anyhow, sometimes it might be a typo. right? Bombers, 400 gallons of fuel, things like that. Destroyers, okay, 3,000 gallons of fuel per hour, right? So it is crucial, and that leads me, it's a good lead in now, what we call the home front, okay, all right, in World War II. And I've talked about the home front in other countries minimally. I don't go a lot into it, all right, but I spoke about the Russian women and the role they played in World War II, everything from snipers to the night witches, to the nurses, to artillery, anti-aircraft batteries. All right, you have that information. But what I want to focus on is the home front in World War II. There's a book that just came out fairly recently called A Call to Arms by Maury Klein. I've read some of his other work. He's usually a kind of economic historian. And this book was remarkable. One of my students gave it to me as like a Christmas gift, and about 900 pages. It was great. Okay, I just finished it about a week ago. But during the course of it, I would jot down certain items, okay, for this lecture. I was reading it for this lecture. He mentions this in the onset. Mass production was the ultimate weapon in the American arsenal. The American way of war was to smother the enemy in weaponry. Well, that's what we're about to demonstrate, and he aptly demonstrates that in this book, A Call to Arms. He also gets into the home front, the strikes and things, and a lot of things I didn't know there, so it was a good read, okay? Again, not insulting your intelligence, you got it all in front of you here, okay? All right, but the government agencies, I'd like to point out that he didn't do this, I'd like to point it out myself, that during World War I, Woodrow Wilson established a lot of agencies, okay? I'm picturing in my head the handout. Okay, it might have been about 40, maybe 3 dozen agencies, governmental agencies, War Production Board, War Management Service, okay, all right, the Committee for Public Information, that sort of thing, all right. That became the model for FDR's New Deal. Remember the alphabet soup legislation, the WPA, the PWA, the CCC, the the National Recovery Act, not the National Rifle Association. But and he's going to use that model again for World War II, creating over 70 agencies. And I listed some of them there. I listed some of the key advisors. Many of these guys were in his cabinet dating back to the New Deal and things like that. I added George C. Marshall. This guy is a brilliant organizer and doesn't get enough credit. Later on, he's going to be Secretary of State. Okay, all right, and the Marshall Plan is going to be his. He's an underrated figure in American history. They also brought in these experts from different fields. They called them $1-a-day men. They would work for $1 a day, okay, because they were independently wealthy. They were CEOs of major corporations. Interesting dynamic here, though, and Maury Klein points this out in the book. They didn't always get along. So you're going to have different guys who are so used to running their organizations, okay, that they don't feel they need input from anybody else, okay, and so you're going to have a lot of clashing, a lot of personalities. And FDR, I found it very difficult to fire anybody, okay, so he created another board and point this guy in charge, and then create a hierarchy who's following who in the pecking order, all right. But so the $1-a-day men are an interesting thing. It's an expression often used, and you'll hear a lot about that. But at any rate, the government agencies. Now, what about the industries themselves? Okay, their issues included strikes, the auto workers, the coal miners, etc., railroad, and FDR felt these are necessary to the war effort, so he had no problem with nationalizing. I didn't know this. Harry Truman threatened to do this with the steel strike after the war, but FDR did it during the war. Even if it was a matter of days, he would nationalize the railroads, take them over in the name of the government, okay, all right, and then send in the troops to make them run, unless those striking workers came back to work, and many times they did, all right. But this is he did what he had to do to win this war. There was the issue of procurement, getting the supplies you need, the raw materials you need, and then distributing them out to the different plants and things like that. One of the things they really had to emphasize was standardization of parts. If you're making car, all right, think about this. You get a flat tire in your car, you need to change the whole tire, it blew out, okay, all right? You got every different rim under the sun. Okay, all right, so you have to, we need to have standardization. All the Jeeps, all the armored vehicles that are using tires, okay, would have a certain caliber to those wheel rims, okay, things like that, all right. They had to develop synthetic oil, had to develop synthetic rubber, and believe it or not, Standard Oil of New Jersey was highly touted in that book as being something that was that they did. Okay, all right. They put us years ahead of the Germans in this. The Germans didn't have any domestic oil supplies. That's why they needed Saudi Arabia. That's why they needed the oil fields of the Caucasus. I've talked about that. That's a definite factor for your last paper. But what you have here is this development of synthetic rubber and synthetic oil. Okay, all right. This helped us win the war effort. The conversion of plants. Okay. Do you know the cars were no longer produced in this country? After February 1st, 1941, they shifted over to vehicles and tanks. Okay, all the major oil companies, over 100 companies were involved in aircraft production alone. Okay, right? So Ford began setting up bomber plants and things like that. Okay, I'll talk about some of those plants in a little bit here. Steel, ships, submarines, cargo ships, whatever you have, used to be riveted. They would have rivets. Okay, you would see the side of the ship and it would have these different just rows of bolts. All right, that's time consuming. Okay, the man hours involved in that are dramatic. All right, what they shifted over to was prefabricated steel production. Okay, which was welded together. Welders. Okay, all right. This enabled, for example, Henry Kaiser. I'll talk about him a little bit. I'll talk about him now, jumping down the page. To produce his Liberty ships. He produced one Liberty ship in 4 days. It's amazing how these Liberty ships were produced and sent out to the docks, etc. I think I have some numbers on that elsewhere. Okay, but at any rate, welding rather than riveting was the key to that. Okay, so the conversion of the plants, the welding versus the riveting. And then you, of course, have to bring in, okay, we can do it, Rosie the Riveter, okay, all right? Well, they just weren't riveting, but the estimates are that between 17 and 19 American women, 17 and 19 million American women went into the factories, okay, all right, and worked in the war effort. That meant 17 to 19 million men who could go off to war. End of the day, we put about 11 million men. Some accounts go 13 million. Okay, into the war overseas. But at any rate, that certainly helped out as well. African Americans, they had migrated northward from the southern cotton fields, okay, the southern subsistence farms, tenant farms, okay, during the 1920s, okay, all right, the migration continued. Some even migrated before World War I, and they were going after the war industry jobs in the north. In 1943 alone, an estimated 400,000, almost 500,000, came northward into northern cities. Detroit's population and other cities like that, Chicago, I think I read the stat in Klein's book that said they increased by almost 20%, okay, the African American population. Another dynamic of this is the West Coast. Now, let's go to a baseball analogy here, okay? The Dodgers and the Giants. When did they move out west, okay, all right, from Brooklyn and from New York? It was 1957, if I recall, all right? And the population had boomed. Why did it boom? It boomed during the war years. People headed out across the country to go out to the West Coast, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but to head out to the West Coast, okay, again, in terms of defense plants job, working in the shipyards, working for the Boeing aircraft plants. I think they were up in Washington, okay, Washington State, okay, all right? So this is a whole new dynamic that occurs within the country. Recycling, okay, copper, silk, steel, iron, rubber, aluminum, brass, cork, and on and on. They would have scrap drives, okay, all right. Churches would have scrap drives and send it to the war effort. The Brooklyn Dodgers would give you a discounted ticket, bleacher seat, if you brought in a certain amount of tin or a certain amount of rubber, okay, things like this to along with your ticket price. So yeah, they all pitched in. Even prisoners from jails were involved in this, okay, all right? I can't believe the hardcore guys, but they actually gave blood donations, all right? They were involved in making uniforms, cloth, and textiles, okay? Money for the war bonds. They helped build the assault boats, the bomb crates literally for hauling bombs, okay? Shell casing, stretchers, okay? Some parolees would even join the army, okay? They could do that as well. So that's another dimension I'd never heard of until I'd read this book. There was rationing. There were food stamps. There was gas. I actually have some gasoline rationing. I think I actually have some in our museum up in the library. Okay, but they rationed sugar, meat, fuel oil. You can see that. Okay, the black market thrived. It's typical of any country. that undergoes rationing. Okay, you're going to have people that get a hold of supplies of food, of meat, of cloth. Okay, silk stockings, for example. Okay, used in parachutes. Women didn't wear them anymore. Okay, all right, because of that. All right, but if they can get supplies of these, they will sell them to factories and to individuals who may want them to produce and then sell to the public. The black market thrived. It's not a particularly pretty picture, but it is something that was going on during this time. There was a shortage of doctors, teachers. Believe it or not, even juvenile delinquency arose, even among girls, okay, all right? They weren't supervised anymore, okay, all right? I read some stories in the Klein book that women would bring their children to work, little infants, little toddlers, babies, and leave them in the car while they worked their shift. I mean, that's a call to DIFUS today, okay? But anyway, all right, centers of war production. The one jumped out at me here, okay, was, or two of them jumped out at me. All right, not only the West Coast, the second gold rush they called it, I spoke about that earlier, okay. Cities in the West Coast grew by 13% in their population. But Camden, New Jersey, there was a shipyard down there that produced not only the battleship New Jersey, okay, but also laid the keel for so many ships during World War II. Camden thrived as a shipyard during this time. Bridgeport. I got my undergraduate degree from the University of Bridgeport, and our practice football field in the spring practices was nearby the Sikorsky helicopter plant. Okay, that developed during the interwar years. It was thriving during World War II. Bridgeport, Connecticut, also developed as a center of war production. There were many of them, okay, a lot on the West Coast, okay, things like that. You have down in Louisiana, the Higgins boats, which are the landing craft you saw in Saving Private Ryan. They were developed in Louisiana. Henry Kaiser's shipyards, I spoke about that. Standard Oil of New Jersey, I spoke about that. General Electric had 68 plants and 170,000 workers. They worked on the Navy propulsion systems, the diesel engines for the submarines and things like that. Okay, the Willow Run plant in Michigan. This was an aircraft plant that made B-24 Liberators, and they were producing a B-24 every hour off their assembly lines. Okay, there were 70 assembly lines. Okay, this plant was 1 mile long. All right. Slow getting started, but when it did, man, it pumped out these planes, okay, all right? We're going to get to the numbers later on in terms of what they produced. So the war production centers, okay? Klein made a book that after D-Day, they had a problem with now downsizing. Downsizing is always an issue, okay, all right? Reconverting the industries back to domestic production, okay? No more parachutes, so we go back to silk stockings, okay? All right, just to use a metaphor there, all right? But the reconversion of plants was difficult, okay? And they projected that down the road, America might be headed for a massive depression. Now, I'm going to show you how they address that later on. All right, what about some of the other episodes in domestic United States? West Coast. There's an old John Belushi movie called 1941, and it has these guys in utter panic, okay, on the West Coast thinking the Japanese were coming the next day, okay, all right? The Japanese never had a design of attacking and landing on the West Coast, all right? But we didn't know that back then. There was one Japanese submarine that sank a freighter right off the coast of the beaches. I think it was Santa Barbara, okay, all right? You could see the ship going down if you're standing on a beach that day, all right? There were balloon bombs, believe it or not, launched across the Pacific trade winds. Some landed up in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, and one woman was killed, okay? That was when one of these things exploded. But domestically, there were race riots in Detroit, in Harlem, in Mobile, Alabama, which is another major shipyard. All right. There was also in Los Angeles something you may never have heard of, the Zoot Suit riots. These were against Mexican immigrants who came up northward. Now, what's a Zoot Suit? If you saw the Jim Carrey movie, The Mask, he was wearing a Zoot Suit. All right. It looks strange, okay, but the idea was this was kind of the image that a lot of the I hate to use this expression, but a lot of the Latino gangs and things like that were wearing, and we assumed every Mexican, every immigrant coming in from the south of the border was one of these gang members, okay? They weren't. They weren't then any more than they are today, okay? But again, this fear of foreigners, xenophobia is what they call it, okay? So the Zoot Suit riots. I haven't got numbers of how many people died, and it wasn't a bloodbath, okay? But still, it was part of the domestic scene. Now, There's also the imprisonment of the Nisei. We talked about that last lecture. Okay, and by the way, I meant to tell you too that I did come up with some numbers on POWs. All right, let me see what I have here. I meant to mark this here and I didn't. Where is it here? POWs. All right, yes. 58% of all Russian POWs died in Hitler's camps, not death camps. Some were sent there, okay, but also too in their slave labor camps. 58% died. 40% died in the Japanese camps, and they were, of course, American, British, Australian, New Zealanders, Indians. Okay, most of them are U.S. If you ever want to get an image of that, read the book, but also to watch the movie Unbroken about Louis Zamperini, the Olympian. Okay, all right, and he survives the death camps on the Japanese POW camps in Kwajalein and in the home islands. All right, at the end of the war, the Japanese issued a kill all order. Hitler did something similar too. All right, the idea of getting cover up our abuses in these death camps and these POW camps by just killing everyone. All right. Conversely, okay, all right, 3.6% of all Axis prisoners in the United States died in the camps. 3.6. Most of those were all natural causes. Okay, things like this. So we followed the Geneva Convention and adhered to the rules, and the other guys didn't. Horrible story. Look at The Bridge on the River Kwai, another good movie for you for extra credit, okay? A Japanese POW camp building the Railroad of Death in Burma. Good movie, classic. Well, coming back to what I started to say about what about Italians and Germans, okay, I'm sorry, the imprisonment of the Nisei, we talked about it last week. What about the imprisonment of Italian Americans? There's no research, little research on this. This is a good doctoral dissertation for you. An estimated 75,000. Even Joe DiMaggio's mom and dad had to register as potential national security risks. Why? Because their name ended in a vowel. All right, think about that, okay? You don't hear much about that at all. Germans weren't arrested in the United States, okay? You didn't get that, okay? Well, all right, and there were actually some riots in at least one of the camps, the Nisei camps, the Tool Lake Nisei internment camp rose in rebellion at one point in time. And they had to call in tear gas used by National Guard members and things like that. One of the most brilliant things that FDR did during his presidency and during the war was his famous fireside chats. I don't have the exact number. There are another notes for another class, but I want to say there were around 80 of them. Okay, we went on the radio, all right, and he basically just chatted, talked with the American people. He was seen as a grandfather. Okay, all right, and he basically would explain what we're doing. All right, transparency, okay? Yeah, it was a salesmanship. He was very good on the radio. He knew how to use the media there, all right? But it was the right thing to do. People trusted him, okay? All right? So at any rate, the fireside chats played a dramatic role. If you ever go down to the FDR Memorial in Washington, I urge you do. Okay, you'll see one exhibit there of one bronze statue, a little room, it's enclosed in a room, of a guy sitting there just listening on the radio, okay, to one of FDR's fireside chats. What about women in service? An estimated 350,000 might have gone into service in any of these different groups. I don't remember all the acronyms here, but the WACS, the Women's Army Corps, the WAVES, which was the women serving in the Navy, SPARS, I forget what they were, WASPs in the Air Corps. The WASPs were interesting. They flew planes. Let's suppose a bomber is built, a B-24 is built over in the West Coast at the Boeing plant, I think it's in Seattle, okay? They'll be the ones to fly the planes across the country to the eastern bases, okay, to be shipped over to Europe and things like that, flown over to Europe, rather than use combat pilots. About 38 were killed during the war. These are the WASPs. About 38 were killed during the war, okay, in plane crashes. B-24 was a death trap, okay? The number of crashes and the number of victims might have exceeded 13,000, okay? It's unbelievable the peacetime aircraft crashes that we really don't hear about, okay? One plowed into I just happened to think of this, a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber plowed into the Empire State Building one foggy night. I think it was 1943. Check it out. Look it up. There was also the Women's Land Army. Now, this was actually the English term, okay? And I do a lot of writing, a lot of books. And the typist that I used in the past for so many of my stuff, she's daughter of an English woman who married an American soldier that came over here. Her mother was in the Land Army, okay? All right? Again, working on the fields, growing the crops, feeding the troops. You have to have men working there, all right? We had a replica of that, but I think the British did a better job with that. Women in combat, over 200 nurses died in World War II. All right, they won over 700 medals and citations, including 565 Bronze Stars. I've said this before, Bronze Stars don't have to be for heroism in battle. They can be for meritorious service. So you're a woman exceeding your production levels, okay, or organizing a bond relief, okay, a recycling drive, maybe you'll get a Bronze Star, okay, all right. Financing the war was a headache. Guys, we were going bankrupt by 1944 and 45. We had to get this war over. God only knows what would have happened if the war lasted until 1948. Okay, but we were spending, deficit spending beyond any credible image. Okay, it was unbelievable. All right, so financing the war, what did they do? Well, they had war bonds they sold. You bought a war bond like a savings bond that your grandmother or something like that bought for you when you graduated 8th grade or when you went to your christening, okay? At your christening. Okay, the idea was that you would give money to the government. When that bond matures, they will pay you back with interest. It's a very safe investment, by the way. They never go down, okay? All right? There were also bond drives. There was also to increase in income taxes. This stat blew me away. We think of everybody paying income tax today. Listen to this. In 1940, only 7% of the American population paid income tax. By 1944, 64% paid, and it's about that today, what it is. Not everyone pays income tax. They get off it with loopholes and everything else like that. There's an area I don't want to go. But the government also charged a 5% victory tax, just a surtax to help finance the war effort. So this was a concern. If they got to get this war wrapped up. It can't keep going on. It's going to bankrupt the state. Now, what about those soldiers coming home? One of the most intelligent things we ever did was the GI Bill. I think it's still in effect today. Okay, all right. You may wonder how some of our veterans on campus can pay for their education through the government, through the GI Bill. Okay, you served a tour of duty in Iraq, Afghanistan, you're eligible for the GI Bill. Okay, they may call it something different that today, I'm not sure, but I do believe it's still called that. Okay, and this passed, are you ready for this? Both houses of Congress, unanimously. What was it? It gave loans for veterans coming back from the war to start up businesses, to buy a car, as they start to reproduce them, to buy a house, okay, to go to college, okay, all right. It absorbed them back into the system. I don't know of any other country that did that, but we did it for our veterans, and it was the right thing to do. Now, these stats speak for themselves. Look at this. I quoted something similar in class back when we first were able to meet. Okay, all right, and they might have been slightly different, but they weren't far off. These are pretty solid numbers. Okay, all right. We built over 300,000 aircraft and almost 10,000 bombers. Okay, all right. One bomber. We built 24,000 transports. I mentioned my dad served on a transport. It was one of 24,000. Okay, all right. 88,000 tanks, 137 aircraft carriers. Now, only about 3 dozen of the big Essex-class carriers, the Intrepid in New York City, okay, all right, but the escort and light carriers. And by the way, the escort carriers, smaller combat planes, were very big and very heavily involved in the anti-submarine warfare. I'm reading a book called Operation Drumbeat right now about the German submarine attacks off the east coast of the United States, and they point that out. What's going to turn the tide in the Pacific is, among other things, the aircraft. I think I mentioned that in our war at sea, but I just want to reinforce it. 45 cruisers, 862 destroyers. We didn't build a lot of submarines. 211 is not a lot. We were not big into submarine warfare, but I've illustrated to you already the submarines played a dramatic role in the war in the Pacific. We did in the Pacific what the Germans never did in the Atlantic. That's another hint for you, okay, for that paper. And look at this, 7 freighters every 24 hours rolled off ship lists. Now the lists are the sliding troughs that send a ship into the sea. Okay, there's so many of them built. Many shipyards had 2, 3, 4, a dozen lists. Okay, all right, 5,777 merchant ships. Okay. That's what Yamamoto was afraid of when he said, I fear that all we have done is to arouse a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. He knew of the productivity. Those other clowns in Japan pushing for war against, I say clowns, okay, I meant it, okay, they didn't know, weren't aware, didn't listen, didn't open their eyes to the American productive potential. They felt the Japanese fighting man was better than the American fighting man. The Japanese way of life was more disciplined and more intensely combative than the Americans were. As a result, they're soft. This is one of the greatest underestimations of an enemy in global history, okay, all right? This is where I come back to that quote by Maury Klein. Mass production was the ultimate weapon in the American arsenal. The American way of war was to smother the enemy in weaponry, and we did. Now, to wrap this up, I want to give a couple of things here about the end game. What's happening in Europe after the armistice has been signed? What's happening in the treaty's been signed? What's happening in the Pacific? Things like this. Europeans in the European theater, there was something called the DPs, and this was a big problem. These are the displaced persons. Now, I have notes on this elsewhere. I want to find them, okay, all right? But basically, we're looking at anywhere between 11 million, okay, all right, and 30 million. 30 million is maybe too high, but 11 million is maybe too low, okay? But so somewhere in that mix, these displaced persons from bombed out cities, they've lost their homes, all right? Here's a breakdown, okay? 10 to 15 million slave laborers from 20 occupied nations. They had comprised 20% of the German workforce. What about the Jews let out of the death camps? Okay, they got to find homes. 1/2 the Russian POWs and Polish workers, okay, I'm sorry, 1/2 million Russian POWs and Poles, okay, were in Russian labor camps. They have to go home, all right? The Red Cross did a remarkable job setting up transit camps, setting up safety stations, for want of a better term, and took care of these people, okay, to find them new homes and get them back to their countries. What rebuilt Europe was, to a degree, the Cold War. We'll be talking about that in just a little bit. But also, too, George C. Marshall, again, comes up with this massive aid package, the Marshall Plan, which ended up being about $14 billion we sent over to Europe to rebuild the cities and things like this, rebuild war-torn Europe. This helps our economy. May sound like a drain, but we're able to produce things that are sent over to Europe to rebuild those cities and industries. Now, what about the Pacific? Operation Magic Carpet. Now, this is amazing, okay, all right? Our Navy actually pulled off the Japanese islands and Japanese places of occupation, about 500,000 Japanese soldiers at the end of the war, and brought them back home. You never hear about that, but Operation Magic Carpet, okay, all right? I can't give you the number of ships involved because I've never read anything about it other than what I've told you now, okay? But it did exist, okay? There were war crime trials for the Japanese, just like there were for the Germans. Not as dramatic. And you know the answer why. We didn't have many Japanese POW leaders, okay, to be put on trial. They all committed harakiri, okay? But there were some instances. The guy who committed the atrocities in Manila, Yamashita, he was executed as a war criminal. I recently read it was only his chief of staff. So again, you read one book, okay, you're an expert. Read two, you're confused, okay. But there were a couple of put up on trial and executed. Yes, we did use the Nazis, former Nazis, low-level Nazis, to rebuild Germany. Yes, we used low-level Japanese officers to rebuild Japan and to help us out of something we needed here in terms of our maybe German rocket program. We Werner von Braun here, things like that, who came to the United States. Okay, all right. So you did have this. Okay, all right. But what rebuilt Japan after the war, more than anything else, was the Korean War. 5 years after World War II ends, we're involved in Korea. Okay, all right. And another thing that helps out too is MacArthur. MacArthur used the emperor, worked through the emperor, keep the emperor alive, so he'll keep the Japanese people in line. We don't have rebellions and strikes. Okay, all right. And he ruled alongside the emperor. All right. There's a movie out there with who is it? Oh boy, I'm drawing a blank on who it is. Okay, Texas actor, not Billy Bob Thornton. I'm drawing a blank on it. Okay, he played in The Fugitive. Okay, he was played Inspector Gerard. Anyway, you'll think of him before me. But the idea is that he played MacArthur in one movie called The Emperor. All right, he was in Men in Black too, along with the African American actor. I'm drawing a blank here. Okay, anyway, all right, so those countries were rebuilt. Okay, Germany was rebuilt as a buffer to against Russia. Okay, because we felt Russia was expanding. Now this is going to lead to the Cold War, and I don't want to get heavily into this, but we have to kind of wrap up the end game here. And what we're looking at here for the origins of the Cold War, I like to cite 5 factors. Now, you know what the Cold War is, okay? That kind of war of tension and words, a massive arms buildup, okay, that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union since 1945, arguably 43, that's a point you could make, okay, all right, till basically the end of the downfall of the Soviet Union in 1991, okay, all right? What is the cause of this? What is this 5-fold cause that I like to point to? One is this issue of a second front. This is why I said you could argue that the Cold War begins in 43. Stalin needed that second front. We've talked about this to leave the pressure that the Germans on the Eastern Front. He wanted England and America to invade France, okay, to create a Western Front which would divide German troops. All right, makes sense. But we kind of delayed in his mind until 1944, and this means the alliance is starting to have cracks in the wall, okay, as early as 1943. Okay, all right. Personalities. Stalin was tough to deal with. So is Harry Truman. Now, I love Harry Truman. He's one of the greatest presidents, okay? But Harry Truman wasn't always the most diplomatic of men, okay, all right? I told you the quote about Chiang Kai-shek's army couldn't fight its way out of a Chinese whorehouse. How do you think that sat with Chiang Kai-shek when he heard about it? So, at any rate, these two guys were clashing at the Potsdam Conference. These two guys were clashing in the early stages of the Cold War, and they do help set the stage for this mistrust, mutual mistrust of each other. Stalin was actually convinced that there's going to be a war coming with the United States. A fear of a depression. Now, this is an interesting facet. You might think of this as being propagandized in a sense from a 1960s, a kid who grew up in the 1960s. Yeah, I graduated high school in 1967, so I was a product of the 60s. No, I didn't have long hair and long beads and bell-bottom pants. I didn't do that stuff. But I was a product of that climate of history. As I'm studying history in the 1970s and as an undergraduate, all right, graduated in 71, all right, as I studied history, I would read the works of William Appleman Williams. I would read the works of the New Left historians who put this theory out there. 11 million soldiers coming home from overseas, war industries plants shutting down, women coming out of the factories. Not so much that part, but the first two I just mentioned. How is the economy going to absorb these things? It's probably going to lead to a massive recession. These guys coming home, these plants shutting down, creates massive unemployment. But if we can keep America on a war footing, producing weapons of war, keeping men overseas, that'll ease the blow. And it worked. There was very little of that. But what that leads to is that us initiating the arms race. And we did. And we bear that burden. Okay? Because how are the Russians going to feel when we start to build up weaponry? We start to rearm Germany as a part of NATO. Things like this. They're going to see this as a threat. And